Well, hello, minders. Welcome back to the hello, minders. Welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. Hope everyone had a fantastic Thanksgiving holiday. I did. I didn't think about videos or art at all. I just took a break from it all, which is why I didn't even tell anybody I wasn't going to do a video. But I'm happy to be back at it this week. And you know, today it's funny because I woke up not really knowing what kind of video I was going to do this week and just thinking a lot about composition. And I had several ideas and wanted to explore composition. And I've had many of you ask me, would you do some videos on composition? And I think probably the best way I can approach this is just to give you some of my tips. There's a lot of traditional concepts, rules, and traditional approaches to composition don't always work. They don't define composition in the intuitive ways that I think it helps. So specifically, we're talking about artistic composition. That should go without saying, but artistic composition we're talking about can be defined this way. It's the placement or arrangement of visual elements or ingredients in a work of art as distinct from the subject. So artistic composition is how you arrange those things. We're not talking about what you put in, but how you arrange them. Now I'm working on my iPad today because this is going to be the easiest way to very flexibly demonstrate. This by no means is to say to you, you're better off if you're working on a digital pad. Not at all. Everything I'm doing here today can be done in pencil. It could be done in paint even. I do a lot of these things actually in watercolor. Let's just talk about some conventional rules or guidelines that you hear a lot about. And I just want to touch on them briefly. These should be considered guidelines, not really rules, because every one of these can be broken successfully, but you need to know them in order to break them. You need to know why you're using them in order to break them. So the first one that you hear a lot about is the rule of thirds. And that's just dividing a painting or drawing into thirds. So you have it going to thirds this way and thirds this way. And the rule of thirds is that you put your center of interest in one of these regions, generally speaking. Okay, this is not a mathematical thing. So you don't go measuring and getting exactly a third. So this is our center of interest. So maybe some kind of a landscape. Your center of interest can be pulled into this area in a number of ways. It can be through leading lines, and that's another concept. That is elements that sort of point your eye that way. It can be through less detail out here, and then more detail as you get to your center of interest. It can be a particular object right in that area. Yeah, I'm doing this very abstractly. It can be value or color. So your center of interest, that's what it's talking about in the rule of thirds. It's generally placed in one of these general areas. And everything else sort of obeys that force and that focus. That's the rule of thirds. Leading lines, I touched on there just briefly. Leading lines is just a way to help you pull an eye in a particular direction. And there are a lot of different ways. A road is a typical thing that you see. A fence line. You know, a row of trees in the background. A stream. It can be swaths of color, swaths of value. So that's leading lines. Another very commonly used compositional concept. And another standard one you see all the time is something to avoid. And that's split compositions. Because your eye is divided, you don't know which way to go. Now, you can split compositions successfully, but you usually want to give one part more weight than the other, and maybe add something, you know, some foreground that pulls your eye more heavily to one side. You know, maybe reduce the amount of focus. And yeah, I am using a lot of landscape examples because this is where a lot of people get into compositional dilemmas. And it's usually easiest to illustrate with landscape. So divided composition is something you want to avoid, especially when dividing is very symmetrical. All right, so let's talk about some tips. And what I want do is kind of make this more intuitive. New, fresh ways to think about composition. I think everybody is aware of some of those generic and general compositional standards that are often taught. But I want you to be able to strengthen your compositional IQ, as it were, your intuitive use of composition. And these are the tips that I have to do that. All right, so the first tip that I have for you is start thinking about composition in terms of abstract shapes or abstract elements. You can use any shapes. I'm using the most basic geometrical shapes here. Now you can do this on paper. What I'm doing is I'm creating layers in Procreate here so that I can move the elements around separately. But if you have tracing paper, you can do that. If you can draw these on regular paper and cut them out if you want to. And the point of this exercise is to give yourself a variety of shapes that you can arrange. And I'm just going to create several here before we get started. So once you get a few of these items drawn, then just start arranging them. If you have them on paper, cut them out so they're separate. Now, keep in mind, I'm not creating a picture. I'm creating an abstract. I'm thinking in terms of a balanced composition, something that leads to a center of interest. Shapes do not have to connect. They can be twisted, turned, and I'm kind of liking what I got here. And the interesting thing about keeping this abstract is you come up with things that you really might not have thought of otherwise. Anyway, this is one way to approach the exercise. Let's try this again, and this time I'm going to use all rectangles. This is actually kind of fun once you get started. It may feel awkward at first, especially if you don't think in terms of abstract, but keep with it. Once you start playing around with it, it really does get a lot easier. I'm not creating a picture, I'm creating a composition, an abstract composition that has some sort of pleasing balanced arrangement, but by the same token, it kind of pulls your eye in one direction or another, trying to make it look like pieces relate. And you can do it in different ways. I mean, that's what makes it art. You can have these pieces less connected. There are no rules necessarily, except that there is something that's overall pleasing about the composition. And the pieces relate to each other in some sort of way so that it looks unified. I like to look at spatial relationships and just get a feeling of flow and balance. So then try this with a pencil or brush. You can get out a watercolor brush and some paint or a pencil. I think pencil is probably easier because you can erase. I would get something big and chunky. Color is not important here. Again, we're thinking abstractly, so this will help you think purely about composition and nothing else, and producing relationships. I'm not going to paint a picture, so that's important to keep telling yourself. This is sort of a stream of consciousness thing. I realize this can feel very, very subjective, and in a way it is, but what you're doing is just focusing on how the items are composed and how they harmonize together. I've got a very textural brush here, but that's really not important in what I'm doing. I think where everything is sort of conjuncting here in the center is too much in the center, so I'm going to try to correct that. I want something that has force and movement and flow. All of these words are compositional words, and if I could define them perfectly, I would, but you can't. This is the intuitive part of art. Other words would be repetition, rhythm. You know, this is why art is so difficult to define. When you get into these intuitive things and you get into ideas that can't be expressed, it's just a feeling sometimes. People have tried to quantify composition. I mean, you probably have heard of the golden mean. It's this spiral that can be described geometrically and even mathematically to describe how good composition can work on a page. It's very similar to the rule of thirds. But that is all describing something that is a good composition. It's not necessarily a rule or a formula that you can apply. And I just keep playing with it till I get something that I think looks good, has interest and contrast, and leads my eye around in interesting ways. And I like that. I'm going to leave that. All right, so that gets hopefully across the point of when you practice compositions, do some abstract. think of a composition in terms of abstract. It'll take your ability to compose and arrange things in pleasing ways and balanced ways. It'll enhance that ability if you work at it. All right, so tip number 2. When you're thinking about composition, think about value. Value is an element. Value is an element almost as important as the object itself. So let's get a little brush here and we're going to do some little landscape thumbnails. And a value can make something stand out. Perhaps the light is hitting these differently behind than is hitting the one in front. Maybe there's some mist there separating it. Right now we have a lot of emphasis here, and this is affecting our composition, not just their placement, but their value. So what happens when we add value to the middle ground hill here, or the one that's just behind the tree line? Our composition has changed a little. Let's add some tone to these behind. Our composition is becoming different, or at least flowing differently. I think you get the point. Value is important, as important in the composition as the objects that you're placing. As you know, I like to paint vignettes a lot, and one of the reasons is because of negative space. So tip number 3, negative space is an element. Sort of a little nondescript landscape composition. So what do I mean by negative space as an element? Well, all of these shapes and all of these little value shapes and object shapes are part of a composition. But there's sort of a hidden, it's not really hidden, but an unseen and often unconsidered element to every design and composition, and that is negative space. So let's just pinpoint that so you'll see what I'm talking about. When you're designing this, you're designing your negative space. That's part of it. And it comes more into play with vignettes like this, but you'll get it even in edge-to-edge scenes. So I've got 4 significant elements here to the compositional design. If I go back and change the positive space elements, I change the negative space elements as well, and they are part of the composition. So as you're designing your composition and placing your objects and your values, pay attention to how these work. Sometimes pay attention to how they work all by themselves, and consider if they themselves are disjointed or whether they flow with the composition itself. All right, so let's talk about tip number 3, and that is studying master compositions, or compositions for master artists. I was really looking forward to this tip. This is, I think, one of the most fun and informative ways of studying composition. It's a great way for somebody who doesn't know anything about composition to take some principles that you might just be finding out about and try to apply them. I think you'll learn more doing this than just about any way. There's just a lot of textbook information out there about composition, and it's really, for somebody who's just learning and trying to apply composition intuitively, it's just very unsatisfying and very uninformative, I think. I mean, some people understand it and can apply it, but when you see it applied over and over again and you go through these steps, you really get a sense of how to do it. So this is Maxfield Parrish, the illustrator from the golden age of illustration. I love the illustrators from that era. Late 19th century, early 20th century, part of the Brandywine School, Howard Pyle, Jesse Wilcox Smith, N.C. Wyeth, J.C. Leyendecker gave rise to other famous illustrators like Norman Rockwell. One of the things I like to try to do, first of all, is find the center of interest and figure out how they accomplished it. I think right now we're looking at this guy. That's where my center of interest falls. It doesn't mean you don't notice anything else, but your eye, as it bounces around the scene, continues to go back there. Now, that's following the rule of thirds pretty well. It's in that quadrant. Well, what else can we discover about this? It's a very blocky illustration, but to a very intentional degree, I think. Look at this red drape here. I think that's just amazing and amazingly beautiful. Very directional light, which is something that Maxfield Parrish did a lot of. So you have a lot of dynamic shadows. But you see his robe and the folds, and then the whole thing just continues down into this drapery. So you have this sort of flow. It just leads your eye through the scene. And then you go, oh man, I almost missed Sleeping Beauty completely. Now, there she is. But for some reason, he wanted you to focus on this character. That's just interesting to me. Now, the second thing that just really jumped out at me were these two boulders. I would not have thought of putting two boulders almost the same height as the character. So you go boom, boom, boom. To me, it's like he's trying to create a repetition, a rhythm, and echoing the character with these statue-like rocks. That's just cool, I think. And if you look closely, it almost seems like this rock is itself a character and pointing at this character. And it almost looks like this rock is a character leaning and looking over the shoulder of this character. I just thought that was cool. But I'm going to turn on a overlayer here that I can draw on. So we've got our center of interest, or our main subject. We've got what I would call a rhythm or repeated sequence here, with emphasis still going here. Nice base. I like this leading eye element. All seems to lead right here. The way I mentioned this too, this to me is an eye leading element. And even the way this rock appears to be a character looking over the shoulder of that. Now, with all of these vertical and blocky composition elements, he didn't fail to add diagonals. And diagonals are a great way to break up very vertical or horizontal compositions. But he didn't make them so dark or light so that they were overwhelming. Anyway, so you got diagonals, which just add dynamics. And this rock here, both have diagonals. Really great composition. So let's look at value. Number 2, value is an element, not just objects. So Sleeping Beauty and the face of these rocks are all very similar value. So you have a very heavy light value there. And they frame this character. And then you have the light value parts of him are the hands and the face. So they stand out because they're contrasted in this field. And all of this cloth here and the trees over here are all subordinate values or darker values. And they all just sort of frame the scene. So that's cool. That all works for me. Let's look at negative space. Now, the only real negative space here, you could actually call, sometimes you can call light values negative space. I tend in this case to look at the sky. I don't see anything particularly outstanding about that negative space as being a compositional element. You know, it helps to frame this in the rule of thirds well. So anyway, just really masterful use of composition. All right, so let's look at another one. Let's do a landscape. So this is the German-American painter Albert Bierstadt, one of my favorite classical landscape painters. And landscapes are great to analyze. If it's a really good, knowledgeable, masterful landscape painter, there'll be a lot to look at and a lot of great things to study. Albert Bierstadt just managed light in landscapes like nobody else, and his originals were huge. If you've ever seen an original Bierstadt, they were practically murals, some of them. All right, so what do I like about this? I like the light, as I mentioned. I like the color. I like the focus of values. We have a nice, what looks like late afternoon sun here with dynamic shadows. Very dark tree lines which frame this area very nicely. A pretty obvious center of interest or focal point that he's bringing you to. Masterful composition will give you several focal points, but they will all be in a hierarchy. In other words, first, second, third, or at least first, and then others subordinate to it. So there's a lot for your eye to see, but your eye just keeps going back here. Perspective is a big thing here. Aerial perspective, that's the receding of colors and values into the distance. Linear perspective, you can see it very definitely in the trees. All right, so our center of interest, or our biggest focal point here, that follows the rule of thirds fairly well. If you consider all of this, it's in a horizontal third. And when you consider this tree here, I like the way he's got tree lines, you know, creating these shapes. One over here, all sort of pointing that direction. But he's got this one little element that sort of brings you from the foreground into the background. So again, placing our central focus right in through here. But you can see other diagonals. So where a lot of these trees are straight up and down, he's created diagonals to give the painting some energy and some movement. These rocks here are arranged in a wedge, kind of echoing that. So you have those nice rhythms. And those are also echoed up here, those kind of radiating diagonals. All bringing your attention here. So he's not just relying on color and value as a compositional element. Just really great stuff. A lot of nice rhythm with the trees. This is something that I use a lot. I love the rhythm of tree trunks used as a compositional design device. What about negative space? I would say if there's any negative space, there's not a lot really. If you could define anything as negative space, it would be this part of the open sky. But it's nice the way these clouds here sort of interlock. And this all points right down again to your center of interest or your main focal point. But the hierarchy of focal points and emphasis, center of interest, is just really neat to me. And then I love what I think is really masterful or masterfully done is that you immediately are taken in by the whole piece, the impact of the whole piece, but then your eye just has a feast of little things to look at. I mean, this little passage right here itself could be framed. I mean, look at this ray of light coming down, shaft of light coming down here. Just really neat. Little tidbits that you can go around and just start a feast for your eyes, like this little area right here. Just gorgeous. This little area right here of the little branches and the highlights on the branches, and yet none of it detracts from the overall compositional force. That's masterful composition right there. And patrons, I will be doing 2 more for you on Patreon, just so you'll know. So look forward to those in the future. I'll be analyzing this Rembrandt here, which is pretty neat. And I will be analyzing this J.C. Leindecker cover for the Saturday Evening Post. Just a really awesome, interesting illustration. So look for those over on Patreon. All right, so my final tip is going back to the abstract compositions that I was showing you. The reason for that is it gets you out of the thinking of objects and realism and gets you thinking in terms of pure, absolute composition. However, we can take that one step further. We can take our abstract compositions, especially if we have one that we like, and I like this one, and we can turn that into a sketch or a painting. Now, what's different about this is the standard way most artists, me included, usually do it. We sit down and think, I'm going to do a landscape. And for example, these were some compositional thumbnails I did, and this is fine. This is the way most artists do it. This is water-soluble graphite. And I drew and worked out the value in the composition for exactly the elements that I was planning on painting. However, you can start this way. And the advantage to this is this really divorces you completely from the objects that might be in the scene. And it might lead you in totally new and fresh ways. I will admit this works best with landscape because landscape has that sort of amorphous, natural, easy to fit into various shapes kind of character about it. It might work with florals too, or some sort of forms of still life. It probably won't work with portraits or animals, but anything that has a composition that will suggest an arrangement that has nothing to do with the objects that you might paint. So I look at this and I do think of a landscape, and I'm just going to use this blue Caran d'Ache tinted graphite pencil, do a little bit of sketching. So taking this composition, and of course you can change it if you want, but I just like some of the dynamics of this. And if you've been watching my channel long, you know how much I love spontaneous landscapes. This is another way of doing spontaneous landscapes. Take the parts that you like about the composition most and work from those. Utilize what has value to you. You know, a abstract composition like this, it allows you to have something to work to, some parameters, but it also frees you to be inventive within those parameters. All right, so I'm going to stop here for now, and I think you get the idea. That was a lot of fun. I hope everybody will give this a try. Thank you so much to my patrons for sponsoring this channel and making this content all possible. We're up to about 625 of you guys now, and I appreciate every one of you. Thank you so much. We'll see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.